The nation's debt, a major topic of debate ahead of this year's presidential election, with the U.S. national debt now well over $19 trillion. Our next president will step into the Oval Office facing a historically heavy burden. Joining me now is David Walker. He was the U.S. Comptroller General under President Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. David, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be back with you, Maria.
You know, we wish that we had this subject come up more often with the candidates, frankly. We're not talking enough about debt and deficits. Which candidate do you see as best in terms of fixing our nation's debt problem?
Well, I don't want to endorse a candidate on the program. Let me, if I can, kind of frame it in ways that I think people will get. If you look at the three Republican candidates, they want to reduce taxes through tax reform. They want to try to constrain spending. But none of them have come up with a comprehensive and integrated plan to be able to get debt as a percentage of our economy down. If you look at the two Democratic candidates, they want to add on new taxes on top of what we already have, whether it be surcharges, higher tax rates, and they want to expand government and spend more for various purposes. And they haven't come up with a plan either to be able to get debt as a percentage of the economy down. So let's hope, Maria, that what will end up happening is that we'll have more as we get to the general election. Clearly, the person who has the most track record on this is Governor Kasich.
Right.
At the same point in time, he hasn't provided, frankly, as much details as some of the other candidates, but he does have a track record both at the federal and state level of being able to come to grips with these issues.
We talk so much about the entitlements being the main problem. Tell us what you think the solution is.
Well, the fact is you can't get debt as a percentage of the economy down to a reasonable and sustainable level unless you do three things. Number one, you've got to have comprehensive tax reform that will make it simpler, fairer, more competitive, increase growth, and increase revenues as a result of that growth. Secondly, you have to reform social insurance programs to make them solvent, sustainable, secure, for current and future generations. That means Social Security, Medicare, but the way you go about it matters a great deal. These are very important social safety net programs that we cannot fray. And thirdly, you have to be able to reprioritize defense spending and reduce the rate of growth in discretionary spending over time. You've got to do all three of those things, and if you don't, you won't solve the problem, and anybody who tells you that they will doesn't know what they're talking about.
You know, he just answered the question as to what you need to do. You need to take half of the Republican side, which is reduce spending, half of the Democrat side, which at the very least is hold taxes, you know, where they are, probably through tax reform, so you're getting revenue in a different way, but you're still keeping it there. And you need to take that medicine. And nobody on either side wants to say, look, not only are we not going to give you free college, but we're also not going to slash your taxes.
The argument that the Republicans make a lot, Matt, I wonder how you look at this, is once you start seeing economic growth, you know, the tax plans, they're expensive if you're cutting corporate taxes, certainly, but economic growth will allow you to pay for it partly. I know that doesn't pay for it all.
I think it's great if it happens, but I think that to build your program around that is perhaps too optimistic in some ways. It's a way of saying we're going to get the dessert without taking the medicine ahead of time, I think. I think that's the problem with it.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it might not happen, and if you do the right things, you'll get better growth. But look, as we've been seeing for some time in the United States, we are in a global economy now, so what happens in China and what happens in Europe and what happens elsewhere affects our growth. So when we start talking about growth rates in 4, 5, 6%, I don't see how we're going to get there and have it be some miraculous savior for us.
And ironically, the slightly improving economy we see here leading to the Federal Reserve hiking rates will send the dollar higher, which is going to be a negative for this economy.
Yeah. David, I've
and
said
Maria,
that, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, I'm on their board, they're nonpartisan, as well as the Tax Foundation, have tried to come up with some estimates of the cost of these programs, considering both static, the normal way they score it, and dynamic, meaning considering additional economic growth.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is, you know, it's a big negative, okay, with regard to what we know right now, and not enough has been provided with regard to, you know, how are you going to reform social insurance programs in an appropriate way? How are you going to constrain spending in order to make the numbers work? Keep in mind, there's a new 4-letter word for politicians and fiscal policy. It's called math.
But David, I said this all along, that until there's some sort of crisis, no one is going to do anything about it. You have a federal government that can borrow at less than 2% a year over a 10-year period. And until you have interest rates that that skyrocket, it makes it difficult for us to pay even the interest on the debt, and then we really have a super lousy economy. Nobody's going to do a doggone thing about it.
Yeah.
Well, the sad thing is the Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates artificially low, which is aiding and abetting, fiscally irresponsible behavior. The fastest growing expense that we have in the next 10 years is interest expense, not just because we're adding debt, but it's expected that interest rates are going to go up somewhat over time. And so we need to recognize that reality. Look, we're either going to solve this problem through one or two things. In reaction to a crisis, which we want to avoid because it would be very ugly,
right,
or committed, inspired, inspirational presidential leadership who tells the truth, talks about the tough choices, brings people together based on a goal with principles and values. I did that in 2012 and going through 27 states, and we got 77 to 90% plus agreement on reforms in all the areas that I talked about and more.
Yeah, you sure did. And I'm glad you mentioned the Committee for a Responsible Budget. We've had Maya McGinnis on this program umpteen times, and she's been terrific in terms of coming out and doing the math after we hear all of the plans from the candidates on whether or not it's actually realistic. David, it's always a pleasure. Good to see you, sir.
Great to see you.
Thank you, David Walker, joining us there.